Well, brethren, we're back again. Hope you are well. We are about to dive into the final part of section one, Master Craftsman Philosophy. So this is the Master Mason discussion. We're going to break it apart, kind of take you through the text again. As always, we've got our trusty copy of Morals and Dogma Annotated Edition out, and we're going to delve into it. As always, I give you the same reminders every time, brethren. If you're participating in the St. Louis group, please make sure you've completed the reading of this section before you listen to this lecture, as it's meant to be a companion. And also, for anyone actively participating or going along, very much we're going to kind of move section by section through the text with the slides. There's some stuff we'll hit on, some stuff we won't, but I would encourage you definitely make sure you're centralizing in on what interests you most in the material. We're just going to hit the highlights and some of the bigger, strong content pieces. So just keep that in mind. We look forward to you enjoying this. The brethren, as I said, we're digging into the material regarding the Master Mason degree. As always, keep in mind when we discuss these craft degrees, this is the craft ritual through the Scottish Rite lens. So that does bend it just a slight bit away from some of the Preston Webb base ideas, base commentary, comments, that type of thing. Just keep that in mind, please, as we go through it. So right out the gate, there's a statement, and I usually like to read these first usual introductory sentences, just because I do think they have kind of a beauty to them usually. To understand literally the symbols and symbols and allegories of Oriental books as to anti-historical matters is willfully to close your eyes against the light. To translate the symbols into the trivial and commonplace is the blundering of mediocrity. All religious expression is symbolism, since we can describe only what we see, and the true objects of religion are the seen. The earliest instruments, of course, of education are symbols, and they and all other religious forms are diffused and still differ according to external circumstance and imagery, and according to the knowledge of those discussing them in their mental cultivation. So very early off, we're hitting straight out the gate this idea of symbolism, the importance of symbolism, but also the effect of that in a greater scope from man. We talk about language being symbolic as far as it's applied, words, of course, having a material sense and things like that. And to present a visible symbol to the eye of another is not necessarily to inform him of the meaning of which that symbol has to you, generally speaking, and that's kind of worthwhile to consider. Just showing a symbol to someone else doesn't mean it's going to have the same impact. It's not going to have the same meaning and understanding, because you're going to look at it differently. And Pike, again, carrying this idea of symbols forward, begins to look and discuss the idea of words as symbols. And of course, we can trace this, at least in my mind and in his, to one of the neatest little discussions in our catechemic work that specifically comes in old exposés, where we hear the phrase about hailing and concealing. I hail, I conceal. Well, there's a misunderstanding of that word, I hail. Of course, it's been interpolated into other statements, from whence do you hail? And because of that, there's been some similarity to it. The old Anglo-Saxon word heal means to cover, to hide, or conceal. And this word, when rendered in the Latin verb, means to cover or roof over, interestingly enough. Therefore, in this statement, I heal, means the same thing as to tile, of course, and itself is symbolic. We talk about, you'll hear brothers talk about tiling a house with tiles, covering it, hiding it, concealing it. There's some symbolism there, but Pike's going to this idea of I hail also means I hide too. I conceal as well. I cover as well. So I cover, I cover. You're both saying you both hide and conceal something. You both conceal, cover, hide, some idea, some knowledge, some secrecy there. Just talking about the idea of words and names, of course, come into play with that and have their own symbolism. A name which stands for something could be confounded with other things and are mistaken, perhaps, for its ending point. The instruments of interpolation for an object lost. Thus, symbols come to usurp an independent character as truth or persons, though perhaps a necessary path. Um, Giving a name or a title to a deity is perhaps a dangerous one to approach him with, in which many ways Plutarch himself says, mistaking the sign for the thing signified, and it can lead you to fall into ridiculous superstition or extremes. That's something we'll talk about later when we talk about the names of the divine and his potencies and things. This idea of mistaking the thing for what, or the symbol for what it signified, can be applied to the divine as well. Now, continuing our idea of symbols, of course, that leads us into the ancient mysteries. And it is through the mysteries, we're told by Cicero, that we learn the first principles of life, wherefore the term initiation is used with good reason. And they not only teach us how to live more happily and agreeably, but they often soften the pains of death by the hope of a better life hereafter. These sacred dramas exhibit some legend that shows nature's changes, the visible universe in which the divinity is revealed, and could be open to various individuals, no matter their level of existence, whether they be pagan, Christian, slave, or free, depending on the circumstance. Nature, of course, is the great teacher of man, for it is the revelation of God in the world. It neither dogmatizes nor attempts to tyrannize by compelling to a particular creed or a special interpretation. It presents its symbols to us and adds nothing in the way of explanation. It is the text without the commentary, and I think that's kind of an interesting way to put it. Nature just presents itself there without the commentary, without the excessive detraction. Man, of course, exists not within a vacuum. There is, of course, the state and the people which compose that state forming its government. And Pike talks about government, the governments of falsehood and deceit. And he says that there are two forms that are favorable for the prevalence of these. Under a despotism, men are false, treacherous, and deceitful through fear. Under a democracy, they are so as a means of attaining popularity and office. When office and wealth become the gods of the people, and the most unworthy and unfit aspire to be the former, and fraud becomes the highway of the latter, the land will reek with falsehood and sweat lies and chance. When offices are open to all men, merit and stern integrity and dignity of unsullied honor will attain them only rarely and by accident. Those offices, to be able to serve the country well, will cease to be a reason why the great and wise and learned should be selected to render service. Pike talks here about this idea that letting wealth come into play can put the most unworthy and unfit into office. But when you base it on merit, integrity, dignity, you see the flip of that. You see those terrible things of falsehood and deceit set aside. The faithless and the false in public and in political life will be faithless and false in private as well. And at length, office and honor are divorced. The place that the small and shallow, the knave or the trickster, is deemed competent and fit to fulfill ceases to be worthy of the ambition of the great and capable. Continuing this idea of government and national prominence, Pike talks of the ideas of greed and danger and national greed and fraud and and trickery and all these other things. And he references several different ideas and concepts, wherein if a nation is in trouble, it in distress, it should take the counsel of those who are wise. But on the contrary, it's always at that point that the wise men seem so scarce, especially when they're needed, and the small men become so bold. Fraud, falsehood, trickery, and deceit in national affairs are the signs of decadence in the state, and they precede the convulsions and the paralysis. To bully the weak and crouch the strong is the policy of a nation governed by small mediocrity. So Pike is here talking about this idea that, there's going to be a point when we really truly need the best of the best, the wisest, to make an effort. We need those men of wisdom and ideas and knowledge, and they're going to be very scarce. Yet the men of the small mind are going to be bold and take charge, and and the use of fraud and falsehood and trickery, it will become more prevalent in the affairs of the country, and it's just a sign of our own decadence, which will lead to convulsions and decay and push the weak out, bringing forth mediocrity and things like that. And within that scope, it's going to breed certain other negative things. When it becomes possessed with the commercial greed, it pushes beyond the just limits. It's going to leave those who it needs to serve aside. And commercial avarice, of course, is going to pick up. And Pike gives several examples. He talks about the greed of the British East India, or the British East India Company, in a way. He talks about the greed of British India itself, and talks about the atrocities there that were committed, the cost of lives for the ambition to extend the empire, the cost of life to expand the commercial empire of Rome and others, and that a nation that grasps the commerce of the world cannot become selfish, calculating, dead to the noblest impulses and sympathies which ought to accentuate it. With all these things, this cold calculation, the self-interest, they're going to displace the sentiments of loftier need, the ideas and the impulses of honor and generosity, by which we grow greatness, and the soul of a nation will be petrified like the soul of an individual who makes God. The despot will occasionally act upon a noble sentiment, perhaps, but that's not to be expected. And even in that action upon that sentiment, an impulse to help the weak, perhaps, and the right against the wrong, he will still likely lapse back. Yet a war for great principle will ennoble a nation. A war for commercial supremacy upon some shallow pretext is despicable, and more often than not just demonstrates the immeasurable depth of the baseness of the men and the nation to which it is involved descended. Commercial greed values the lives of men no more than it values the lives of ants. I think this is an interesting section, especially when we talk about it today, a world that is exceedingly connected, exceedingly linked through economy, through corporations, things like that. Completely different world in a lot of ways than what Pike was experiencing in his time. Justice and punishment, of course, are going to come always into play as action for both the divine execution of what is right and wrong, but also for the law of man as it is written down. And of course, justice in no wise consists in meting out to another the exact measures of reward and punishment which he thinks and decrees his merit, or what we call crime, which is often more merely his error deserving. The justice of the father is not incompatible with forgiveness by him of the errors and offenses of the children. The infinite justice of God does not consist in meting out exact punishment for human frailty and sin. We are too apt to erect our own little narrow notions of what is right as man, narrow notions, and justice into the law of justice, and to insist God shall adopt that as his law to measure off something of our own and call it God's love of justice. Continually, we seek to ennoble our own ignoble love of revenge and retaliation by misnaming it justice. The rules of what is ordinarily termed justice may be punctually observed among the fallen spirits that are in the aristocracy of hell. And so here we're hearkening to this idea of what justice really is in a true sense. Is it what we outline? Is it what the divine outlines? What would deity look upon our laws and think and say within that scope? Justice, of course, divorced from sympathy, is selfish indifference, nor in the least is it more laudable than the anthropomorphic isolation. There is sympathy even among the simplest of animals. And within that, this idea of justice continues. Justice is peculiarly indispensable, of course, to nations. The unjust state is doomed of God to calamity and ruin. This is the teaching of eternal wisdom and history. Righteousness exalteth a nation, but wrong is the reproach of nation. The throne is established by righteousness. The nation that adds providence to providence by fraud and violence, that encroaches on the weak, plunders on its wards, and violates its treaties and obligations, bases itself on base ideas and things like that, will face the consequences which are inevitable and eternal. A sentence is written against all that is unjust by God in the nature of man and the nature of the universe. Of course, when we speak of justice and what is right and what is wrong, we can only be led towards hypocrisy, perhaps. And hypocrisy is the homage, the vice, and wrong pay to virtue and justice. It is Satan attempting to clothe himself in the angelic vesture of light, to do injustice under the pretense of equality and fairness, to reprove vice in public and commit it in private, to pretend to be charitable opinion and sensuously condemn, to profess the principles of Masonic beneficence and close the ear to the wail of distress. All of these things come in play in the ideas of hypocrisy. And a Mason is charged to act on his virtue. These virtues, we're told, were given duties which we must see executed. And hypocrisy doesn't fit into that. Our own ambitions don't fit into that. Yet with all these duties, with all these things that come into play, with all these responsibilities, we're going to be given things that are in our charge, given in things in our authority. And the thirst for power within that scope perhaps is never satisfied. It could be insatiable. Neither men nor nations have enough power. When Rome was the mistress of the world, the emperors called themselves to be worshipped as gods. The Church of Rome claimed despotism over the soul and over the whole life from the cradle to the grave. It is grave and soul. It gave and sold absolutions for past and for future sins. And he goes on to talk about the kings and queens of England claiming allegiance over countries long before they'd even set eyes on it. You know, Spain conquering the New World without ever really seeing much of it at all. This idea of expansion against it, acquisition, growth, to seek to subjugate the will of others, to take the soul captive, is wrong and rightly not proper. And it is the exercise of the highest object of human ambition, at least in the darkest manner. Yet all these actions, all this hypocrisy, all this ambition can, of course, bring negative feelings. And it is, of course, natural if we feel wrong and perhaps to desire some form of retribution. But we must persuade ourselves to step away from that and to submit to the divine's will in that belief. because revenge is a wild kind of justice. And if it not be in human nature not to take revenge by way of punishment, let the Mason truly consider that in doing so he is God's agent, and so let the revenge be measured by justice and tempered by mercy. The law of God is that the consequence of wrong and cruelty and crimes shall be punishment, and the injured and wronged and the indignant are as much. Revenge may be a natural feeling, as Pike notes here, perhaps, or a natural desire that we feel when we're wronged, we want some retribution. But it's noticed here, yes, that may happen, and perhaps there are circumstances wherein a Mason would be God's agent, or in taking that justice, which is tempered by mercy. But the consequences of wrong, the consequences of cruelty, shall meet their punishment at the divine hand at the very least. Stepping now more towards symbolism and some broader concepts, especially since this is the Master Mason degree, we begin to look at things like the symbols of the divine, the ancient symbol of the sun, and within the scope of this lecture, we bounce quite a bit around as we look at some things here. So the Hebrew word for gold was zahab, which also meant light, interestingly enough, of which, of course, the sun provides light and is the source for our planet. And to the ancients, light coming from the sun or otherwise was saw as an outflowing of deity. To us, as to them, it is an apt symbol of truth and knowledge. It is also a reminder of the upward journey of the soul through the spheres, symbolically, whence the soul came and had its origin, and whither it will go after death. It is not strange thousands of years ago, obviously within general context, to know that many people worship the sun, and that today, of course, continues in various smaller sects. Originally, they looked at the sun as some distant god, of course, and over time they personified these beings in one way or another as a supreme god, whether it be Brahma, Almond, Osiris, Baal, Adonis, Malakarth, Mithras, and Apollo, one way or another connecting the sun and some form of it to that. And thus the nations adopted those as their deities, grew old, and over time died. Moss grew on their capitals and columns, and of course they dissipated, the roofs of their temples falling in. But it was not strange in that time for them to have that type of a ritual, a religion and faith, considering the connotations of it. Of course, central to the Master Mason degree is Hiram Abiff, and the word Kurum, Hiram or Kuram or Huram, is a compounded one. Gesenius renders Kurum as a word meaning noble or freeborn. Kur means white or noble. It also means the opening of a window or the socket of an eye. Pike takes quite a bit of time here to look at various deities as well as the meanings of these names, consider their relationship. He speaks of Egypt in particular, talking about Ra, Horus, as called by the Egyptians in various forms. He talks of different forms of the divine that could be tied to this idea of Kuram or Kurim, or Hiram as we would know him. And he talks, of course, about other relationships to the idea of light in the sun. And pieces things together as he goes. In particular, one interesting thing he does touch on is within reason a image that we're going to share with you here just in a second, that Pike creates, and he copies it from a Egyptian monument using sources he found elsewhere. And you can find this image on page 153. Within it, Pike merged two illustrations to create his hieroglyphic picture. He claims that this image has its own kind of legenda to it, if you will. But it pops up. It is in the original Morals and Dogma text, and it comes from these two other images that are combined, in which he removed Anubis. He added some other imagery to it to conform to a more of a Masonic feel. And I would encourage you to look at page 154 of that. But he talks about the identity of the legend, referring to the Hiramic legend, is also confirmed by this hieroglyphic picture copied from an ancient Egyptian monument, which also enlightens you to the lion's grip and the master's gavel. Again, the lion's head being added into this. Some of the other allegory and things added as well. But this, of course, comes to us in the same line that Pike is talking about Hiram. He's talking about Egyptian symbolism, and he talks about the contest between Horah, Set, and Set Nubai, which is basically the Osiris and Typhon allegory, wherein, of course, Osiris is slain, he's buried, or cut apart, all these other things occur, and then he's raised from the dead in a similar fashion, we would say, that would line up in an abstract form with the Hiramic legend. Of course, keeping with Hiram, he has to also go after the last name, Abith. And of course, he talks about the ancient Phoenician character of this. He denotes that it could simply mean father or of my father. It's absurd to add the word Abith as part of the name directly, since it's not a surname in any way. And he talks about Joseph, who says in Genesis, God has constituted me Abla Para, or father to Para, or the father to the Pharaoh. So Haman was called the second father of Artaxerxes. And when Hiram used the phrase Kuramabi, he meant that the artificer he sent to Solomon was just a principal workman in the line of Tyre. It's an interesting thing to consider. Pike does take a lot of time to break apart Hiram Abiff's name, in consideration of that, and considering it to several other deities and symbolic structures and things like that that are worth our note. Of course, he also points out that a learned brother, of course, places over two symbolic pillars from right to left, the words we know regarding those pillars. But he also talks about accidental coincidences, that the name of the murderers, the Tyrians, can be referenced to evil deities of the Hebrews. I think that's an interesting point he makes. And he says the three final syllables actually relate to the sacred word of the Hindus, which mean the triune God, the living God, life-preserving, life-destroying characteristics. Interesting discussion there. I would reference you to go back to Master Craftsman Symbolic Lodge and its discussion on the Tyrians. I won't go too much into it here. He kind of gives you a 1,000-foot view of that commentary as he considers it. And even the footnotes within the annotated version of the text actually reference you to that material. So, diving away from symbolism again, we go to the power of the state and the republics. And we're told a lot of things about the state and its power and its efforts, and that every commonwealth will have periods of trial, tribulation, transition, especially if it engages in war. And there's going to be times when there may be agitation, and baser elements may gain traction, and all these things can change on a dime. But there's going to be time where it may be, as put here, is purified in the transmigration by fire and blood. But we must remember that to preserve liberty, another must be added, that a free state does not confer office as a reward, especially for questionable citizenship or services, unless she seeks her own ruin. All officers are employed by her in consideration solely of their will and ability to render service in the future, and therefore that the best and most competent are always preferred. Keeping that in mind, the states and the idea of the republic, the idea of democracy, the idea of a government for the people will continue with sound leadership rather than misguided leadership. Now, of course, what can lead to misguided leadership? There is the danger of politics, and politicians in a free state. Pike notes are generally hollow, heartless, and selfish. Their own appeasement is the end of their patriotism, and they will look at with satisfaction on the fall of anyone whose loftier genius or talents overshadow their own importance. Of course, the consequence is that those who feel themselves confident and qualified to serve the people will refuse with disgust to enter the struggles for office, where wicked and Jesuitical doctrines come into play, that all is fair in those political actions. Of course, Pike means that pejoratively, more referencing the wicked and the those involved in political intrigue with their doctrines. He goes on to talk, of course, as he speaks of politicians, and it's worth noting, obviously, his own experiences in the political realm of the world, in the time in which he existed. His thoughts on politicians are probably going to be a little bit interesting, but he says it's lamentable to see a country split into factions, each following this or the great or brazen fronted leader with a blind, unreasoning, unquestioning hero worship. It is contemptible to see it divided into parties whose sole end is the spoils of victory, and their chiefs the low, the base, the venial, and the small. Such a country is in the last stages of decay and near its end, no matter how prosperous it may seem to be. You could easily reason, in regard to that he himself is speaking a little bit about the United States, in the connotation of the struggles that occurred in the 1850s, as well as through the Civil War. The 47th problem of Euclid, it now finds Pike's sight. And of course, it is a proposition older than Pythagoras, and Pike takes some time to break it apart. And he talks about how the 47th problem displays to us perhaps some sacred significance. And he goes in to begin talking again back to Egypt. And he talks about how the Egyptians arranged their deities in triads: the father, or the spirit and active principle or generative power; the mother or matter, the passive and conceptive principle; the son being the issue or the product in the universe, proceeding through the two principles. These were Osiris and Isis and Horus. In the same way, Plato gave us the thought, the father, the primitive matter, the mother, and cosmos, the world, and the sun, the universe, animated by the soul. Plutarch tells us in his book, De Acide Deostatide, but the better and diviner nature consists of three: that which exists within the intellect only in matter, and that which proceeds from them, which the Greeks call the cosmos, of which three Plato is wont to call the intelligible, the idea, exemplar, and father; matter, the mother, the nurse, and the place and receptacle of generation; and the issue of the other two, the offspring or genesis, the cosmos, the word signifying equally beauty and order of the universe itself. You will not fail, Pike tells us, to notice the beauty and symbolized by the junior warden in the South. And in the text, we see Pike continuing kind of his discussion on the triad, if you will, this time with an image of Osiris, Isis, and Horus. That's on page 161. The Tetractys, of course, Another interesting symbol, we're told that two clasped hands could also represent this symbol, as it represents the number 10, a number sacred in many spheres, and of course expressed by the Tetractys. The image you see here expresses the divine name through that symbol. And it leads you on, we're told, not only to the study of Pythagorean theory of numbers, but toward the Kabbalah and discovering the true word and understanding what is meant by the music of the spheres. All the forces at man's disposal or under man's control are subject to his influence and his working tools. That's an important thing to note. We have those abilities under our control, and those are really our working tools. Our skill, our force, our knowledge, all those are within us. Morality, of course, is a force. It is the magnetic attraction of the heart towards truth and virtue, the needle imbued with mystic property and pointing unerringly to the north, carrying the mariner safely over the trackless seas. Honor and duty are pole stars of a Mason, by which we should never lose sight, and we may avoid a disastrous shipwreck. Realizing some of those other bits and pieces that come in our toolbox, that come to us at times, we learn that habit is also a great force, and it is second nature, even in trees. It is as strong as a nation of men. So also are prejudices, which are given to men and nations as the passions are as forces, valuable if properly and skillfully availed of, destructive if unskillfully handled. Above all, the love of country, state pride, the love of home are forces of immense power. Encourage them all. Assist upon them in your public men. If you have eloquence, it is a mighty force. See that you use it for good purpose, to teach, to extort, to ennoble the people, not to mislead them, corrupt them, or lead them astray. Specifically, Pike references those who use eloquence in a negative fashion become the assassins of public liberty and of morals. The will is a force. Its limits are yet unknown. It is the power of the will that we chiefly see, the spiritual active and the divine active in man. It is in men of will and action, not in men of pure intellect, that we see the world governed. These, of course, are going to be coupled with things like faith, hope, and charity, the greatest moral forces. Faith, which is only true wisdom and very much the foundation of our government. Hope, which is strength and ensures success. And charity, which is beauty and alone makes animated and united our united efforts possible. All of those things come together are going to push us in our efforts. They're going to push us towards being an active part of the state, being an active part of humanity, and an active acquirer of knowledge, because man only advances by degrees. The removal of one pressing calamity gives courage to attempt the removal of the remaining evils, rendering men more sensitive to them, and perhaps sensitive for the first time. Liberated from arbitrary power and governed by the law alone, they begin to scrutinize the law itself, and they desire to be governed, not only by law, but by what they deem to be the best law. And when the civil or temporal despotism has been set aside, and the municipal laws have been molded on the principles of the enlightened jurisprudence, they make way to discover that which they're living under in some priestly or class 8 ecclesiastical despotism, and they become desirous of working toward a reformation in similar vein. That progress of freedom advances onward, and when emperor and church appeal to reason, there is naturally universal suffrage. The great problem, of course, is to find guides who will not seek to be tyrants. This is needed even more in respect of the heart than the head. Every man can earn his own special share of labor, but not by trickery or deceit. Useful knowledge, honorably acquired, is too often, after fashion, not honest or reasonable. So the studies of youth are far more noble than the practices of manhood. The labor of the farmer in his fields, the generous return of the earth, tend to make him earnest, grateful. The education of the marketplace will make him querulous, crafty, envious, and intolerable. Of course, masonry is going to seek to ennoble us in various ways and lift us up. And it seeks to be this beneficent, unambitious, disinterested guide to our lives. And it's in this condition that all of the great structures and sounds of the hammer and the clink of the trowel should always be heard in a building. With faith in man, hope for the future of humanity, loving kindness for our fellows, masonry and the brother mason must always work and teach. Because masonry has already helped us cast down so many other idols from our pedestals in our lives, and to grind the improbable dust, the chains and the links which have held men's souls in bondage. Realizing that reason and science demonstrate to us the modes of existence and being balanced with each other, bring equilibrium according to harmony and hierarchical law, we know how to move forward. We understand that when that hierarchy is synthesized and ascending and becomes even more and more monarchical, we can have issues. Yet, reason cannot pause a single moment for us not to be alarmed by that. Therefore, we must step up and understand what our faith leads us to. Plato wrote to Dionysius the Younger in regard to the nature of the first principle and said that I must write you in enigmas, so that if my letters are intercepted by land or sea, he shall read them and may have no degree to comprehend. And then he says, all things surround their king. They are on account of him, and he alone is the cause of good things. Second for the seconds, and third for the thirds. Comments like this are interesting as we begin to look at deeper symbolism. And that's what we're beginning to address here, especially with the idea of the Sephiroth. The king representing Ansoth being supreme and absolute, and from this center, which is everywhere, all things ray forth. In the divine world, or Azaluth, which is that of the first cause and wherein the whole eternity begins, everything begins and exists as unity. In the world of creation, which is the second cause, the world of Bria, the autocracy of the first principle is complete, but we conceive of it only as the cause of the second cause. Here it is manifested by the binary, and in the creative principle, passive. Finally, in the third world, Yetzeria, or formation, it is revealed that the perfect form, the form of forms, the world, the supreme beauty and excellence, created perfection, comes into existence. Having had all this discussion about the ideas of faith, belief, convictions, the divine, Pike, of course, wants to address the flip side of that coin, which is, unbelief, doubt, and how it can be dangerous in play. The perception of the light is the dawn of the eternal life and being. The word of God, which creates the light, seems to be uttered by every intelligence that can make cognizance of form and will take and look. The light, in fact, exists in a condition of splendor. Yet it can be, by various opinions, confounded by others in doubt. It is not beyond the tomb, but in life itself that we are to seek for the mysteries of death. Salvation and reprobation begin here below, and the terrestrial world too has its heaven and its hell. Always, even here below, virtue is rewarded. Always, even here below, vice is punished. And that which makes us sometimes believe in the impunity of evildoers is that riches, those instruments of good and evil, seem sometimes to be given to them at hazard. All true initiates have recognized the usefulness of toil and sorrow. Sorrow, says a German poet, is the dog of that unknown shepherd who guides the flock of men. To learn to suffer, to learn to die, is the discipline of eternity and the immortal Navid or Novite. Keeping that in mind, we learn that Masonry, like all religions, all mysteries, Hermeticism, alchemy, whatever it may be, conceals its secrets from the adepts and sages or the elect. And it uses false explanation and interpretation of its symbols to mislead those who deserve to be misled, to conceal the truth, which it calls light, from them, and to draw them away. Truth is not for those who are unworthy or unwilling to receive it, who would pervert it, misuse it, all those things. And of course, Pike here uses and notes that perhaps God incapacitates those men with a color blindness, per se, and leads the masses away from the highest truth, giving them the power to attain only as much as it is profitable for them to know. Every age has a religion suited to its capacity. And he goes on to talk about, there are other levels of that in various other frames. The teachers of Christianity are more leveled. Of course, there's a book so little known as much as the Bible. Of course, to most who read it, it is incomprehensible as the Zohar. But Masonry, of course, jealously conceals her secrets, intentionally made to lead the conceited interpreter astray. There is no sight under the sun more pitiful and ludicrous at once than the spectacles of the Prestons and the Webbs, not to mention the later incarnations with their dullness and commonplace explanations, undertaking to explain the old system's symbols of Masonry and adding and improving them. To the circle, enclosing the central point and tracing itself between the parallel lines, a figure which is purely Kabbalistic. 3 persons have been added and superimposed to the Bible, and even reared on that a ladder with 3 or 9 rounds and given vapid interpretations, all to excite admiration. It's an interesting thing to think about as Pike touches on these concepts. And I encourage you to go back through the text, consider what Pike talks about in regards to Hiram's name, to the Egyptian mysteries. We didn't specifically call it out, but very here at the end of this section on page 179, there's some material on William Preston and Thomas Smith Webb, and Pike talks here about the spectacle of the Prestons and the Webbs. He was not a fan of either of these gentlemen. He felt very much that there was a lot of vapid, useless symbolism or bad explanations put into the text. And so he comments on that at length in Esoterica, in other texts, but here he's calling it out again. Consider the commentary which talks about presenting a visible symbol to the eye of another, not necessarily to inform of the meaning which a symbol has to you, but what relevance that can have, as discussed early on. And of course, take a time to look at some of the meanings of a biff. What relevance did it have? What significance? How does that function in the symbolism of the craft and in the scope of our fraternity? With that said, brethren, we have just completed section 1 of Master Craftsman Philosophy. We hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found something enlightening to think about. You can now proceed to take the section 1 quizzes. If you've not been taking them one at a time, you want to knock all of them out now, 1 through 4, and enjoy that. Next up is the Lodge Perfection. So we're looking forward to beginning that discussion with you soon. Have a great rest of your day. And remember, Masonic education matters.